Not every beginning announces itself. Sometimes it's hidden in small choices, a knock on a stranger's door, a hand held too tightly, a promise spoken too quickly. For one mother, those choices grew into a storm of conflict and devotion, betrayal and forgiveness. The path carried her to a truth no one could see coming, and when it arrived, it changed everything. Watch carefully, because the end reshapes the whole. If this story holds you, make sure to like, subscribe, and share in the comments what gripped you most and where you're watching from. Tamara Green, a 22-year-old black single mother in Houston, stood inside the tiny back room she rented, clutching a glass jar that rattled with the last of her money, $17. That was all she had left to her name, and her 3-year-old daughter Leah needed medicine that cost $50. The fever had burned through Leah for 2 days straight, her cough dry and raspy, her body restless even in exhausted sleep. The doctor at the community clinic had scribbled a prescription with little sympathy, and Tamara had nodded, though her heart sank because she knew the number written on that slip of paper was far beyond her reach. She had been told many times that being a black woman in this city meant walking uphill on roads that were never built for her success. And tonight, she felt every inch of that truth. Yet despair alone could not feed her child or cool her fever. So before dawn, she had stirred cocoa, condensed milk, and butter into a pot, pouring her hopes into 35 small fudge bites. Each one represented a chance, a possibility, a prayer that somewhere behind the iron gates of Houston's wealthiest neighborhood, someone would show mercy long enough to buy them. When she wrapped each piece and placed them neatly on her tray, she whispered to herself that she would fight until she had the money, even if it meant swallowing pride that had already been battered by rejection too many times to count. As the rain beat hard against the cracked windows, she pressed a kiss to Leah's damp forehead and whispered she would be back with the medicine. Leah stirred, murmuring for her mother not to leave, and Tamara's chest tightened so fiercely she nearly abandoned her plan. But to sit still was to let the fever win, and she would not allow that. She handed Leah into the care of Mrs. Alma, the elderly neighbor in the front house, who had always shown kindness without judgment. Alma squeezed Tamara's hand, told her to be strong, and Tamara nodded, though her eyes burned. She stepped into the night with her tray clutched tight, and the rain instantly soaked her jacket. The bus ride toward Oakwood Heights jolted her on every turn, making her grip the container as though it held her very soul. The other passengers glanced at her in that way she knew too well, half pity, half disdain, the way people looked at black women carrying homemade goods to sell. She fixed her gaze on the blurred lights outside the window and reminded herself why she was enduring this humiliation. $50 stood between Leah and relief. $50 was all that mattered. When she stepped off the bus, the storm slammed down with renewed fury. Puddles splashed up against her shoes as she hurried toward the first mansion. Its pristine white columns glowed under the street lamps, and she imagined the warmth inside compared to the cold that clung to her skin. She rang the bell and waited. Silence. She rang again. Nothing. She turned away and trudged to the next house. An elderly white woman opened the door a crack, eyes sweeping over Tamara with suspicion. Tamara explained quickly about her fudge, offering her brightest voice, though her heart raced. The woman sniffed, muttered about the price being high, then bought 2 pieces as if performing charity. She closed the door before Tamara could thank her properly. Tamara tucked the coins into her pocket, each one small but precious, and forced herself onward. At the third house, she did not even see a face. A man shouted through the gate that he never bought food from strangers and told her to move along. The words cut like knives, and she bit her lip to keep her composure. She could not afford to cry here, not in front of people who already saw her as less than human. The storm intensified, rain stinging her face, plastering her curls to her cheeks. Her blouse clung to her skin, translucent and thin, but she kept moving because Leah's name pulsed in her mind like a drum. Every rejection pushed her closer to despair, yet every step forward was an act of defiance. She would not quit. She spotted a mansion at the far end of the street, larger than the rest, with a wrought iron gate and gardens sculpted to perfection. Even under the storm, the fountain in front continued to spill crystal streams, arrogant against the chaos of the weather. For a moment, Tamara hesitated. The place looked too immaculate, too intimidating, the kind of house where a woman like her was expected only as invisible labor. She thought of the whispers she had heard all her life, that black women did not belong in spaces like these unless scrubbing floors or tending children. The weight of that history pressed down on her shoulders, but then Leah's feverish face flashed in her mind, and Tamara's hesitation shattered. She ran through the rain, pressed the bell, and waited. Her chest heaved, her hands trembling as she shielded the tray from the downpour. She braced herself for another cold dismissal, another reminder that she was unwanted. Instead, she saw movement beyond the gate. Not a maid, not a guard, but the man of the house himself. He was tall, perhaps mid-40s, with dark hair streaked with gray at the temples and eyes that seemed to glow even in the dim light. His clothes were casual yet unmistakably expensive, and his posture carried the authority of a man used to being obeyed. Tamara stiffened, expecting arrogance, perhaps disgust. But when his eyes met hers, something unexpected flickered there. Not pity, not contempt, but a weary kind of curiosity, as though he recognized the weight she carried because he carried his own. The melodic chime of the bell still echoed inside the mansion as he stepped closer, stopping just behind the iron gate. Rain poured between them, soaking her to the bone, but she lifted her chin. She would not cower, her voice shook, but did not break. The man introduced himself briefly, Richard Caldwell, his tone clipped but not unkind, and she nodded in silence, repeating the name in her head because it sounded like something from another world, a name that carried power, heritage, and wealth in every syllable. When they reached the enormous double doors, he pushed them open and ushered her inside, the sudden warmth of the foyer making her shiver harder as water dripped from her clothes onto the glossy marble floor. A chandelier glittered overhead, scattering prisms of light across the walls, and for a moment she felt as if she had wandered into a dream, but the tightness in her chest reminded her that she was not here for wonder or beauty. She was here because her daughter's fever demanded it. Richard handed her a towel from a nearby cabinet and said simply, "Dry yourself before you catch pneumonia." She muttered thanks and wiped her face, still clutching the tray with one hand, unwilling to let go of the only lifeline she had. He studied her with an intensity that made her uneasy. Not the condescending gaze she had expected from a wealthy white man toward a struggling black woman, but something heavier, as though he were trying to decipher her entire story just by looking at her soaked figure and trembling hands. She straightened her back, remembering her father's words that dignity must never be surrendered, no matter how much life tried to strip it away. He asked how old her daughter was, and Tamara's voice softened as she answered, 3. "She's been sick for days." Richard's expression shifted, the guarded sternness giving way to a flicker of pain that seemed almost personal, as if her words had struck a nerve buried deep in his chest. He leaned against the counter, folding his arms, and asked quietly about Leah's father. Tamara hesitated, but decided honesty was easier than fabricating a lie when her exhaustion already weighed on her like lead. She told him that Leah's father had left when he learned she was pregnant, that it had been just the two of them against the world ever since, and she lifted her chin to show she carried no shame for surviving alone. Richard nodded, his eyes darkening with recognition, and murmured, "I understand." His response surprised her, because she had expected judgment, perhaps even a suggestion that she had been careless or foolish, but instead she sensed he knew something of abandonment himself. He walked into the kitchen and motioned for her to follow. The vast space gleaming with appliances worth more than her entire yearly earnings, and Tamara felt her throat tighten at the contrast between his abundance and her scarcity. He asked how much money she needed for the medicine, and she answered without hesitation, $50. He did not flinch, did not haggle, did not even ask if the price was fair. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a leather wallet, and handed her a crisp $100 bill. She froze, staring at it as though it were an illusion, because never in her life had anyone offered her more than she asked for without attaching strings. "For your daughter," he said, holding her gaze until she slowly reached out and took the bill with a hand that trembled despite her efforts to stay composed. Gratitude swelled in her chest, but suspicion lingered at the edges, because life had taught her that generosity from men with power often carried hidden costs. She began to thank him, but he interrupted with words that made her heart stumble. "I'll buy all the fudge, every piece, and I have a proposal you may want to hear." Her instincts screamed caution, but his tone was calm, steady, not the voice of a man seeking to exploit, but of someone who had thought carefully before speaking. "Can you cook more than sweets?" he asked. She blinked in confusion, then answered that she could make just about anything because her mother had taught her before she passed away. He nodded, as if that was the answer he had expected, and then delivered the unexpected. He wanted her to come work for him, to take care of his house, to cook and clean, and he would pay her $2,000 a month plus room and board for her and Leah. The offer hung in the air like thunder after lightning, shocking her so completely that she could only stare at him, her mind racing with disbelief. $2,000 a month was more than she could make in months of scrubbing floors, selling sweets, and babysitting. Yet the very enormity of the offer made it dangerous, because nothing in her world came without risk. She asked why he would make such a proposal to a stranger, and he raked a hand through his hair in a gesture that seemed uncharacteristically vulnerable for a man of his stature. Tamara stood frozen in the gleaming kitchen, the $100 bill still warm in her hand, the tray of fudge on the counter now irrelevant compared to the weight of Richard Caldwell's offer. She had walked into this mansion desperate for a $50 miracle and now faced a proposition that promised $2,000 every month, a private room for herself and Leah, and the kind of stability she had not dared to imagine. Her mind spun with suspicion because experience had taught her that a poor black woman never received anything without hidden conditions. She had worked enough houses to know that wealthy white men often cloaked their desires under the guise of opportunity, but Richard's steady gaze held none of the predatory hunger she had seen before. Instead, there was loneliness etched into the lines around his eyes, a hollowness that resonated with her own grief. Still, Tamara forced herself to speak cautiously, her voice measured, as she asked him what exactly he expected in return. Richard leaned against the marble counter, his posture casual, but his words deliberate, as he explained that he wanted her to manage the household, cook meals when he was home, and keep the place from sinking deeper into silence. He confessed that he had not been able to keep a housekeeper for more than a few weeks because they all complained the mansion felt like a tomb, haunted by the absence of his late wife and daughter. The admission hit Tamara unexpectedly hard, stirring both compassion and unease, because she knew the pain of loss yet also feared stepping into a house steeped in grief. She asked why he thought she could succeed where others had failed, and his answer came with quiet conviction. Because she was not just another employee, because she reminded him of resilience he had once known in his father, and because her daughter's presence could bring life back to a place that had grown cold. Tamara swallowed, her heart thudding with the weight of his words, and thought of Leah's flushed cheeks and feverish breath back in Mrs. Alma's care. $2,000 a month could mean medicine, healthy meals, preschool, and a future beyond survival, yet to accept such an offer from a man she had met less than an hour ago seemed reckless. She told him she needed time to consider, but Richard surprised her again by saying he expected nothing immediate, that he only wanted her to think about what stability could mean for her and Leah. He pushed the tray of fudge toward her and said he would buy it all regardless, insisting she keep the money for the medicine tonight. As Tamara gathered her belongings to leave, he walked her to the door, and for the first time she noticed a softness in his step, as though he were weary in ways deeper than physical fatigue. He held the door open and wished her well with a sincerity that disarmed her suspicions, just enough to make her wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, this man was not like the others who had tried to exploit her vulnerability. She left the mansion with the $100 bill clutched tightly, and the image of Richard's solemn green eyes burned into her thoughts. On the bus ride back, her heart battled between fear and hope, rehearsing every possible danger while also imagining Leah in a room of her own, safe and cared for. By the time she reached Mrs. Alma's small house, she had resolved nothing, but she knew she could not dismiss the offer outright. Inside, Leah stirred weakly when Tamara pressed the medicine to her lips, and as the fever began to break, Tamara whispered a promise to fight for her child's future, no matter how uncertain the path. Over the next 2 days, Richard's offer consumed her thoughts. She went about her cleaning jobs, distracted, burning with questions she had no answers to. On the third day, she found herself standing once more at the iron gate of the mansion, tray empty, but courage trembling within her. She rang the bell, and when Richard appeared, his expression was calm, as though he had been expecting her. He welcomed her inside, and this time she brought Leah with her, because she needed to see how he would treat her daughter before making any decision. Leah, her curls bouncing and eyes wide with curiosity, clung to Tamara's leg at first, but Richard knelt down to her level, greeting her with warmth instead of formality. He pointed toward the garden, telling her there was a playhouse he had once built, and Leah's innocent giggle filled the mansion like sunlight breaking through clouds. Tamara watched with cautious relief, realizing Richard did not merely tolerate Leah, but seemed genuinely touched by her presence. As the visit unfolded, Richard outlined the practical details. A small room prepared for them in the guest wing, weekends off, Leah's schooling left entirely in Tamara's control, and a clear promise that if it ever did not work, she could leave with severance. His clarity made the offer sound less like a trap and more like an opportunity, yet Tamara still weighed every word, reminding herself that trust could not be bought so easily. But when she tucked Leah into bed that night in their cramped, rented room and listened to her daughter whisper about the big house with the garden and the kind man with green eyes, Tamara knew the choice was becoming inevitable. The next morning, she packed their meager belongings into 2 small suitcases, kissed Mrs. Alma goodbye with gratitude, and returned to Oakwood Heights. Richard greeted them at the door, not with grandeur, but with simple acknowledgement, as if he understood the enormity of what she was risking by stepping into his world. He carried one of the suitcases to the guest room himself, showing them the space he had prepared, modest compared to the rest of the mansion, but clean, warm, and equipped with a twin bed for Leah and a full bed for Tamara. When Leah squealed with delight at having her own bed for the first time, bouncing on the mattress as though it were a trampoline, Tamara felt her throat tighten with a mix of joy and sorrow. Richard watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable, though his eyes softened when Leah laughed. Tamara Green carried the last of their small suitcases down the long hallway that led to the guest wing of Richard Caldwell's mansion, her heart thudding with both fear and anticipation, while Leah skipped beside her, delighted by the echo of her footsteps on the polished wood floors. Richard walked a few paces behind, silent but observant, as if careful not to intrude on the moment but unwilling to leave them alone in a house that had been still for too long. When Tamara opened the door to their new room, she was struck by its size compared to the cramped back room they had shared before. The clean white linens, the soft lamp glow, and the small basket of toys placed near Leah's bed made it feel almost like someone had prepared the space with tenderness rather than mere formality. Leah immediately clambered onto her bed, bouncing with laughter, while Tamara set the suitcases down and tried to calm the storm inside her chest, whispering thanks to God under her breath for this temporary reprieve from desperation. Yet even as gratitude warmed her, unease crept in, for every polished surface of the house seemed to hum with an absence too profound to ignore. That first night, after Leah had fallen asleep clutching a stuffed bear from the basket, Tamara lay awake listening to the silence pressing in from all sides, a silence so thick it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. She rose quietly, stepping into the hallway, and her bare feet carried her toward the great staircase where moonlight streamed through tall windows. On the walls, she noticed photographs in silver frames, most of them featuring Richard, a beautiful blonde woman, and a little girl about Leah's age. The woman's smile radiated confidence, the child's eyes sparkled with mischief, and in picture after picture they stood beside Richard, whose guarded expression in life had been replaced with joy she had not yet seen. Tamara's throat tightened as she realized these were the wife and daughter he had lost. The reason the staff had whispered the house felt like a tomb. She stared at the frozen images of a family that would never move again, and suddenly she understood why Richard had looked at Leah with that haunted softness, because in her innocent laughter he heard echoes of the daughter he would never hold again. When she returned to bed, her thoughts raced with unease, wondering whether she and Leah were here to be themselves or to serve as shadows for ghosts that still roamed the halls. The following morning, Richard greeted them at breakfast with politeness, sliding a plate of pancakes across the table to Leah, who devoured them with enthusiasm. Tamara noticed how his eyes lingered on Leah's messy delight, softening for a moment before he caught himself and retreated behind the mask of composure. Over the next days, Tamara settled into her role, cooking meals, cleaning rooms, and managing the daily rhythm of the house, while Leah explored the garden and filled the empty spaces with giggles. Yet Tamara could not shake the feeling that the house itself resisted her presence, its cavernous halls echoing with whispers of lives cut short. One evening, as she dusted a shelf in the library, she found a small pair of shoes tucked in the corner, scuffed from play, abandoned as if waiting for feet that would never return. She held them in her hands, the weight of tragedy pressing down, and when Richard walked in, his eyes locked on the shoes before he quickly looked away, his jaw tightening. She placed them gently back, murmuring an apology though she had done nothing wrong, and in that moment she understood that the mansion was both refuge and prison, a place where wealth could not shield against grief. Despite the strangeness, Leah flourished in the new environment, running through the garden, playing in the miniature house Richard had built years before, and bringing life into spaces long deprived of it. Watching her daughter's joy gave Tamara strength, yet also stirred conflict within her, because every smile Richard gave Leah seemed tinged with the memory of another child, a reminder that they lived in the shadow of loss. One night after dinner, Tamara found Richard sitting alone in the music room, his fingers tracing the keys of a grand piano, though no sound came. She asked softly if he played, and he admitted that his wife had, that the piano had not been touched since the accident. For a long moment they sat in silence, the unspoken grief between them palpable, and Tamara realized that Richard's offer had not been about charity or control alone, but also about survival, his own desperate need to fill a void that threatened to consume him. Still, she could not ignore her own doubts, because she had seen too many people try to use others to patch wounds that could never fully heal. One evening, after Leah had fallen asleep, clutching her new bear, Tamara stepped out into the backyard to breathe under the stars, her thoughts tangled between gratitude and unease. Richard joined her, standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the night sky. He began speaking of his late wife Caroline, of their little girl Grace, and his voice trembled when he admitted he had not spoken their names aloud in months. Tamara listened in silence, her heart aching for him, but also wary, because she could feel how easily shared grief could blur into intimacy neither of them had intended. When he turned toward her, eyes glistening, she saw in them not just sorrow, but a hunger for connection, and she quickly looked away, reminding herself that she was here for Leah, not for herself. Still, she could not ignore the warmth in her chest when he thanked her for bringing life back into the house, for giving him a reason to come home at night. The fragile balance shifted abruptly when Tamara's past reappeared. It was a Thursday afternoon, rain tapping gently against the kitchen windows when the doorbell rang. Tamara was folding laundry, Richard in his office upstairs, Leah coloring at the table. When she opened the door, her breath caught. Standing there was Marcus Daniels, Leah's biological father, the man who had vanished when Tamara was pregnant. He looked older, hardened, but his eyes carried something unsettling, a mixture of regret and determination. "Tamara," he said, his voice low, almost rehearsed. "I need to see my daughter." Shock rooted her to the spot, anger and fear flooding her in equal measure. She managed only, "Why now?" before Richard appeared in the hallway behind her, his presence towering and protective. His gaze locked on Marcus with immediate suspicion, as though sensing danger the way a soldier senses an ambush. The air thickened with tension, Leah oblivious as she hummed and scribbled on her coloring sheet. Marcus introduced himself stiffly as Leah's father, and Richard's jaw clenched, his voice cold as he demanded to know why a man who had abandoned his child thought he had any right to appear now. Marcus's reply was halting, claiming he had changed, that he had steady work and wanted to be in Leah's life. Tamara's mind reeled. The house that had seemed to promise safety now trembled with uncertainty, because the past she had buried was suddenly at her door, threatening the fragile future she was building for her child. That evening, after Marcus left with the promise to return, the house felt different. Leah played with her dolls in innocence, but Tamara and Richard sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the silence heavy with unspoken questions. Richard's protectiveness flared, his words edged with anger as he insisted Marcus had no place in Leah's life after years of absence. Tamara pushed back, reminding him that Leah was her daughter, her decisions to make, and Richard, stung by the rebuke, fell silent, his expression wounded. Tamara's heart ached at the sight, but she would not yield her autonomy. She had spent too many years surviving on her own to let another man, however kind, dictate her choices. Yet she also could not deny that Richard's anger came from a place of fierce loyalty, of love, even though he had not yet spoken the word. That night she lay awake, torn between the safety Richard offered and the threat Marcus posed, knowing that any decision she made would shape Leah's life forever. The following day, Marcus returned as promised, this time carrying a small gift for Leah, a doll with braids, chosen with care, though Leah only looked at it with polite curiosity. "Mommy, who is he?" Leah asked, her innocent voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Tamara's throat tightened as she explained, "Sweetheart, this is your father." Leah blinked, confused. "Like Uncle Richard?" she asked, glancing toward the man who had read her bedtime stories, kissed her scraped knees, and tucked her in at night. The words stabbed Richard, though he masked the pain with stoic calm, while Marcus flinched at the realization that another man had already filled the space he had abandoned. Leah clutched the doll but quickly ran to show Richard, her natural instinct revealing where her trust truly lay. Richard knelt, admired the doll, and Leah laughed. The sound like a dagger to Marcus, who saw in that moment how deeply another man had claimed the bond that should have been his. The confrontation escalated when Marcus asked to take Leah for an afternoon outing, insisting he had the right as her father. Tamara refused firmly, her voice steady, reminding him that trust had to be earned, not claimed. Richard stepped forward, placing himself between Marcus and Tamara, his presence radiating a warning that needed no words. Marcus bristled, his pride wounded, but he left with a glare that promised he would not give up easily. As the door shut, Richard turned to Tamara, his eyes burning with intensity, and said quietly, "I won't let him take her from you." The words were both a promise and a confession, leaving Tamara shaken, because for the first time she felt the full force of Richard's devotion not just to Leah, but to her. The following week weighed heavily on Tamara Green, for the reappearance of Marcus Daniels had stirred every insecurity she thought she had buried, and now the once quiet mansion thrummed with unspoken conflict. Leah remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her, filling the halls with laughter as she bounced between her mother and Richard Caldwell, whose steady presence had become the anchor of their fragile, new life. Yet Tamara sensed that the threads holding everything together were fraying, stretched thin between Richard's protective determination and Marcus's stubborn insistence on reclaiming what he had abandoned years before. On Tuesday afternoon, the tension finally boiled over. Marcus arrived unannounced, striding into the grand foyer with the confidence of a man who believed blood gave him rights beyond reproach. Tamara met him at the door, her voice firm but her heart pounding as she told him Leah was napping, that this was not the time. Marcus pushed back, his tone sharp as he accused her of letting another man replace him, his eyes cutting toward Richard, who had stepped down from the staircase with the cold authority of a man defending his ground. The two men faced each other, one clothed in wealth and composure, the other carrying the raw defiance of a man who felt cheated of his family, and Tamara found herself caught between them, her voice rising above their confrontation as she demanded they both stop treating her life like a prize to be fought over. The silence that followed her outburst was thick, yet beneath it smoldered a truth she could not deny. Marcus might be Leah's father by blood, but Richard had become her father in every way that mattered. The next morning, Tamara awoke to find Leah curled against her, whispering questions no child her age should need to ask. "Mommy, is that man really my dad? Do I have two dads now?" Tamara kissed her forehead, answering with care, telling her that family was not just about blood, but about who stayed, who protected, who loved without leaving. Leah listened, wide-eyed, and then asked, "So Uncle Richard is my dad too?" The words sank like stones into Tamara's heart, for though innocent, they echoed the truth she wrestled with nightly. Richard had stepped into a role Marcus had forfeited, and Leah's instinctive trust could not be undone. Later that day, Tamara watched from the kitchen doorway as Richard knelt beside Leah in the living room, helping her piece together a puzzle of a bright red barn. His patience, his gentle voice, the way he celebrated each piece she fit correctly, it was the portrait of fatherhood, painted not with grand gestures, but with daily devotion. Marcus, watching from across the room where he had been allowed to visit briefly, saw the bond and bristled, his fists tightening as jealousy consumed him, when Leah, without thinking, threw her arms around Richard's neck and exclaimed, "Daddy Edward, we did it!" Marcus's face darkened, and the room froze under the weight of his wounded pride. That night, Tamara confronted Richard in the study, her voice low but urgent. "You can't let her call you that," she said, her chest tight. Richard looked at her, pain flickering in his eyes, and answered softly, "She chose it, Tamara. I never told her to, but if you want me to stop her, I will." Tamara shook her head, torn between reason and instinct. "No, I don't want to confuse her, but Marcus won't stand for it. He'll see it as an attack, and he already thinks you're replacing him." Richard's reply came with quiet fire. "I'm not replacing him. I stepped in because he left. Leah deserves someone who won't disappear when life gets hard." His words stung because they carried a truth Tamara could not deny. Yet they also frightened her because they revealed how deeply Richard had already intertwined himself into their lives. The following weekend brought the inevitable clash. Marcus arrived with flowers and promises, asking Tamara to consider giving him another chance to let him be the father Leah needed. His voice cracked as he claimed he had changed, that he had grown, but Tamara saw through the performance, the same charm that once deceived her. Richard interrupted, his tone sharp as steel, warning Marcus that empty promises would not erase years of abandonment. Their argument spiraled, both men circling each other like predators, until Leah toddled into the room clutching her doll, her eyes wide with fear. "Stop!" she cried, her small voice trembling. The men froze, guilt etching their faces, but the damage was done. Tamara gathered Leah into her arms, glaring at both men, and declared that she would decide what was best for her daughter, not them. Her voice shook with fury and heartbreak, for the truth she carried silently was that Marcus's sudden return had not been about Leah's needs, but his wounded pride at being replaced, while Richard's protectiveness, though genuine, had begun to feel like possession rather than partnership. That night, as she tucked Leah into bed, Tamara whispered reassurances, promising her child that no matter what happened, she would always keep her safe. But when she stepped into the hallway, she found Richard waiting, his face heavy with conflict. "Tamara," he began, "I know I crossed a line, but I can't stand by and watch him hurt you again." Or Leah. She looked at him, exhaustion in her eyes, and asked a question that haunted her. "And what if in protecting us, you become just like him, deciding for me, speaking over me, making choices that aren't yours to make?" Richard flinched, the truth cutting deep, but he reached for her hand and said, "Then tell me how to be better. Because losing you both isn't an option I can live with." For the first time, Tamara saw not just a man of wealth and power, but a man stripped raw by fear, a man who had already lost once and could not bear to lose again. Richard, restless and unable to focus, began leaving the house earlier and returning later, his mood shadowed by an urgency Tamara could not explain. When she asked, he brushed her off with vague assurances that he was handling things, but the distance in his eyes betrayed that he was planning something he did not want her to know. Meanwhile, Leah continued to bridge the gap between them with her innocent questions and unshaken trust, running into Richard's arms when he returned from work and tugging at Marcus's sleeve when he appeared for his short, supervised visits. Both men basked in her affection, both pained by the sight of the other, and Tamara carried the burden of keeping the fragile arrangement from crumbling. But it was Richard who tipped the balance first. One afternoon, he asked Tamara to join him in his study after Leah had gone to preschool. She entered the room and noticed an envelope resting on the desk, thick with bills that made her stomach churn before he even spoke. Richard admitted that he had met with Marcus privately, offering him money in exchange for disappearing from their lives forever. His voice shook as he confessed, not with shame, but with the desperation of a man who had convinced himself that love justified any means. Tamara's face went pale, her body trembling with fury as she demanded how he could make such a choice without her consent. Richard tried to explain that he had already lost one family, that the fear of losing another was unbearable, that he was willing to tarnish his integrity if it meant securing their safety. But to Tamara, it sounded like betrayal. "You don't get to buy my life," she whispered, her voice cutting deeper than any scream, and she stormed out, her heart breaking because the man she had begun to trust had treated her and Leah like property to be negotiated. Marcus, meanwhile, stood at the crossroads of conscience and greed. The envelope Richard offered contained more money than he had ever seen, enough to start fresh somewhere else, enough to bury the failures that had defined his 20s. At first, he resisted, his pride refusing to let him be bought off. But as he sat alone in his one-bedroom apartment, staring at the stacks of hundreds, he felt the gnawing pull of opportunity. He convinced himself it was for the best, that leaving Leah in a stable, wealthy home was an act of love rather than abandonment. The lie tasted bitter, but it dulled the sting of guilt. When he returned to Tamara, he wore the mask of a man with sudden prospects, spinning a story about a job offer in another city that required him to leave immediately. Tamara listened with narrowed eyes, sensing the hollow ring of his words, but Leah, too young to understand, only asked if he would bring her back another doll when he returned. Marcus hugged her tightly, perhaps more tightly than ever before, then walked away, the weight of both the money and his cowardice pressing heavily against his chest. For Tamara, the days that followed were filled with confusion. She was relieved that Marcus had vanished once more, but the relief was poisoned by the knowledge of how it had been orchestrated. She could not look at Richard without seeing the envelope, without hearing his justification echo in her head. He tried to mend the breach, cooking dinner with her, playing with Leah, even apologizing with rare vulnerability, but each gesture felt tainted. She questioned whether his love was genuine or merely another attempt to control the chaos around him. At night, she lay awake listening to Leah's soft breathing, haunted by the possibility that she had traded one form of betrayal for another. Yet she could not deny the way Richard loved Leah, the way his entire being softened when she clambered into his lap, the way his eyes lit up when she called him daddy without hesitation. That bond was real, unbought, unforced, and Tamara clung to it as proof that not everything was tainted. Richard himself was unraveling. Though Marcus had accepted the money, Richard felt no victory, only a gnawing shame that grew heavier each time Tamara avoided his gaze. He replayed the moment in his mind over and over, wondering if he had destroyed the very thing he sought to protect. At work, he snapped at employees, canceled meetings, and brooded over architectural plans without focus. At night, he sat alone in the music room, staring at the piano his wife once played, his heart weighted by guilt. When Tamara finally confronted him again, her voice was calm but firm, sharper than any accusation. "I ask you for respect. I ask you to trust me. Instead, you chose money to solve a problem that wasn't yours to fix." Richard admitted he was wrong, his voice breaking, but he begged her to see his actions as the desperation of a man who loved her. "Love without trust is nothing," she replied, tears in her eyes, and for the first time since they met, Richard feared she might leave. The breaking point came when Leah innocently asked one evening, "Mommy, when is my other daddy coming back?" The question silenced both adults at the dinner table, Tamara frozen, Richard pale as if struck. Tamara forced a smile and said softly, "He had to go far away, sweetheart. He won't be coming back." Leah tilted her head, confused, then turned to Richard and said with childlike certainty, "Then you're my only daddy now." The words, simple and pure, sliced through the tension like light through a storm. But for Richard, they carried both joy and unbearable guilt, because he knew the truth of why Marcus had vanished. Tamara saw his reaction and knew he could not carry the secret forever. That night, after Leah was asleep, Richard confessed everything: the meeting, the envelope, the bribe. His voice cracked as he begged forgiveness, insisting that his only motive was to protect them. Tamara wept, not from shock but from the confirmation of what she had already suspected. She told him she could not stay in a house built on deception, no matter how much love she felt, and she packed her things with trembling hands. Richard watched from the doorway, helpless, his heart breaking as the two people who had given his life meaning walked out into the night. He had thought he could solve the problem with money, but money had only bought him emptiness, the cold echo of a truth he could no longer escape, that love demanded trust, not control. Meanwhile, in the cramped back room of Rose Henderson's modest home, Tamara tried to build a new rhythm for Leah. Each morning she packed Leah's preschool bag and forced a smile, though inside she was torn apart by conflicting emotions. She told herself she had done the right thing, leaving before she allowed Richard's wealth to define their lives. Yet each night, when Leah whispered, "When can we see Daddy Edward again?" her heart cracked a little more. She hated him for trying to buy Marcus's absence, for undermining her authority as a mother, but she also hated the undeniable truth that he had loved her and Leah with a devotion no other man ever had. That war raged inside her, and it drained her strength with each passing day. Richard could not stand the distance, so he went searching. He drove to the old neighborhood, his suit hanging loose on his thinner frame, dark circles carved under his eyes. Rose Henderson answered the door, her sharp eyes softening when she saw the state of him. She invited him in reluctantly, and though she did not promise to persuade Tamara to see him, she carried his message, that he was broken, that he knew he had destroyed their trust, that all he asked for was a chance to beg forgiveness face to face. Tamara wrestled with the decision for 3 nights, lying awake while Leah slept beside her, listening to her daughter's soft breaths and wondering whether she was selfish for denying Leah the bond she craved. Finally, she agreed to meet him, not in the mansion that still smelled of wealth and deception, but in the public safety of a small park near her old neighborhood. The following afternoon, Richard arrived early, sitting stiffly on a bench, his once polished shoes scuffed, his tailored suit wrinkled, the weight of sleepless nights pressing down on him. When Tamara appeared, walking slowly with her head held high, his breath caught. She looked thinner, her face lined with exhaustion, but her presence carried a dignity that made her more beautiful than any jeweled woman who had ever graced his arm. She did not sit immediately, only studied him for a long moment before taking a place a few feet away, her arms crossed as if to shield herself from him. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant sound of children playing. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but edged with pain. "Why, Richard? Why did you think you had the right to buy away Leah's father?" He swallowed hard, his throat burning as he confessed. He explained his desperation, the terror that consumed him at the thought of losing them, the blindness that drove him to believe that money could secure what love alone should hold. He admitted it was cowardice, that in trying to protect them, he had destroyed the very trust they had given him. Tamara listened, her face unreadable, her heart raging with hurt. "I had already chosen you," she said at last, her voice breaking. "Even with my doubts, even with Marcus showing up, I was staying. And you didn't trust me. You trusted your wallet instead." Richard's chest caved under the weight of her words. He reached for her hand but stopped himself, letting it fall back to his lap. "I know," he whispered. "I was wrong. I destroyed everything. But, Tamara, these last 15 days have shown me something. Money means nothing. Without you and Leah, I'm just a man in a prison made of stone and glass. I don't want wealth. I want family. I want the life we started to build together. I'll spend the rest of my days proving I deserve another chance, if you'll let me." Her tears slipped free, though she quickly brushed them away. "Do you understand what you did to me? You humiliated me. You made me feel like an object being bargained over. And worse, you proved Marcus right. You proved that the men in my life think I'm something to be traded." Richard flinched, shame stabbing deeper than any punishment she could have inflicted. He shook his head fiercely. "No, Tamara, you're not an object. You're the woman who saved me, who brought me back to life when I had given up. I see that now. I see that love isn't about control. It's about trust, and I broke that trust. But please, don't say I'm like him, because I will never leave you. Never." She studied him for a long time, her heart aching with both love and fury. She thought of Leah, of the way her little girl's eyes lit up when Richard entered the room, the way she called him daddy without hesitation. She thought of the nights Richard had sat on the floor with Leah, building puzzles and telling stories, of the gentle way he carried her when she was sick. Those moments had not been bought, they had been real. Finally, Tamara sighed, her voice softer. "I don't know if I can forgive you, but I do know that Leah misses you. And maybe she deserves the chance to have the only father who's ever truly been there for her." Richard's heart surged, tears blurring his vision as he whispered, "Thank you. That's all I ask for a chance." Over the next days, Tamara allowed him to visit Leah in the park under her watchful eye. Leah's joy was undeniable, her little arms wrapping around Richard's neck, her laughter ringing with a purity that melted Tamara's defenses. She saw how he looked at Leah, not as a child he had claimed through power, but as the daughter he had chosen with his heart. Slowly, against her will, the wall she had built began to crack. One evening, as Leah fell asleep after a long day at the park, Tamara sat alone, thinking of Richard's tear-filled eyes and the trembling in his voice when he promised to change. She knew forgiveness would not come easily, but she also knew love. Real love was rarely simple. Richard, for his part, resolved to prove his devotion not through money or grand gestures, but through humility. He called on Rose Henderson to watch Leah one evening and asked Tamara to meet him again, this time not with envelopes or proposals, but with nothing more than his heart. They walked the park slowly, and he told her everything: the guilt, the shame, the nights of sleepless grief. He promised that if she gave him another chance, he would let her lead, that he would never again try to solve her life with his wealth, that he would listen and follow her example. And for the first time, Tamara believed him. For the first time, she saw a man not trying to control her, but trying to deserve her. Richard Caldwell's life shifted after that first meeting in the park, for Tamara Green had given him something more precious than forgiveness. She had given him a chance to prove that he could be more than the man who tried to solve everything with money. Each day he arrived quietly, sometimes with nothing more than a small storybook tucked under his arm, sometimes with a simple bouquet of wildflowers, picked from his own garden, but never again with anything that could be mistaken for a bribe. Tamara allowed the visits reluctantly at first, her sharp eyes watching every interaction, but Leah's joy was undeniable. She threw herself into Richard's arms, laughing as he spun her around, clapping with glee when he read her favorite fairy tales in a deep, animated voice. Tamara tried to remain detached, but she could not help noticing the way Richard's eyes softened every time Leah called him Daddy Edward, nor could she ignore the ache in her own heart when she saw how naturally he fit into the role Marcus had abandoned. Still, her mistrust lingered. At night, when Leah asked if they could go live with Richard again, Tamara lay awake wondering if she could risk her daughter's heart on a man who had already broken hers. Richard knew he was walking a razor's edge. Each word, each gesture mattered. One wrong step could destroy the fragile progress he had made. He fought against his own instincts. The businessman in him wanted to fix things with solutions, to close the deal with a signature or a check, but he forced himself to stay patient, to let Tamara lead. He bit back the urge to insist when she hesitated, swallowed his pride when she questioned him, and replaced his old habits with a humility that was new and uncomfortable but necessary. He told himself that love was not a negotiation. It was a daily act of showing up, of choosing to stay, of proving worth through consistency. And though it tormented him to keep his distance, he resolved that he would earn his place one quiet day at a time. Yet the shadow of Marcus lingered. Though he had taken the money and left, whispers reached Tamara through old neighbors that he had been seen again in the city, restless, drinking heavily, and telling anyone who would listen that he had been cheated out of his family. The news unsettled her, because though she despised his choices, she knew his pride would not let him disappear without resentment. She confided in Richard one evening as they walked Leah home from preschool. His jaw tightened, and though he promised not to act without her consent, Tamara saw the storm in his eyes. She reminded him firmly that Marcus was her burden to deal with, not his, and that if he wanted to remain part of their lives, he had to trust her to make decisions for Leah. Richard swallowed his instinct to take control and nodded, though inside he burned with the need to protect them. The turning point came one Saturday when Leah's preschool held a small spring festival in the park. Tamara agreed to let Richard accompany them, though she warned him it was not a date but simply an afternoon for Leah's sake. Richard accepted gratefully, determined to show her he could respect boundaries. At the festival, Leah darted from game to game, her curls bouncing as she laughed, her face painted with bright butterflies. Richard bought her cotton candy, holding her hand as she licked the sticky sweetness with delight, and Tamara could not deny the warmth of the scene. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to walk beside him without suspicion, their steps falling into rhythm as though they had been partners for years. Then, as Leah tugged them toward the puppet show, Tamara felt Richard's hand brush against hers. She stiffened at first, then let it linger, surprised by how natural it felt, how much she had missed the safety of his touch. That evening, after Leah fell asleep, Tamara sat on the porch of Rose Henderson's house with Richard beside her. The spring air was cool, carrying the scent of blooming jasmine. They spoke quietly, not about money or Marcus, but about their childhoods, their dreams, their regrets. Tamara admitted she had once wanted to study early childhood education, to open a small preschool of her own, but life had stolen that path when she became pregnant and alone. Richard listened intently, tucking the dream into his heart like a vow. When she asked about his late wife and daughter, he spoke with trembling honesty, describing Caroline's laughter and Grace's boundless curiosity, and for the first time, he did not weep. Instead, he smiled softly, as if remembering them no longer crushed him, but reminded him of the love he was still capable of giving. Tamara reached over and took his hand, surprising herself as much as him. "I can't promise I'll forgive you overnight," she whispered, "but I can promise I'll try." Richard's throat tightened as he whispered back, "That's all I'll ever ask." Over the next weeks, Tamara allowed more of Richard into their lives. He drove Leah to preschool when Tamara worked late cleaning houses. He fixed the leaky faucet in Rose's kitchen. He showed up not as a savior, but as a steady presence. Leah flourished under the combined love of her mother and Richard, her laughter brightening every room, her innocence binding them together. Tamara, slowly but surely, began to lower the guard around her heart. She realized that forgiveness was not a single act, but a series of small choices, a willingness to believe in change. She still carried anger for the betrayal, but she also saw how Richard's actions since then were different, how he resisted every instinct to control and instead chose to listen. The true test came when Marcus resurfaced one last time, drunk and bitter, confronting Tamara outside the grocery store where she bought discounted bread and milk. He accused her of selling him out, of choosing a rich white man over the father of her child. Tamara, holding Leah's hand tightly, stood her ground with a steadiness she had never felt before. She told him that being a father was not about money or promises, but about presence, about choosing to stay when life was hard. "You had that chance," she said coldly, "and you sold it away. Don't you dare blame me for your cowardice." Marcus staggered, stunned by her strength, and for once he had no reply. He turned and stumbled off, vanishing into the night. Tamara felt Leah squeeze her hand and whisper, "Mommy, we're okay, right?" And she bent to kiss her daughter's forehead, whispering back, "Yes, sweetheart, we're okay." The weeks after Marcus's final disappearance settled into a rhythm that felt, for the first time in Tamara Green's life, like the beginnings of peace. Leah thrived with the steady presence of both her mother and Richard Caldwell. Her small world no longer fractured by absence or confusion, but strengthened by stability and love. Richard made a conscious choice every day to show up not as the wealthy man who could buy solutions, but as the father and partner who chose patience, humility, and honesty. He rose early to make Leah's favorite pancakes, sat at the table with her as she scribbled drawings, and waited while Tamara led decisions about their routines and boundaries. For Tamara, the transformation was both healing and terrifying. She still carried the scars of betrayal, the memory of the envelope Richard had once offered Marcus, but she also saw that his actions since then were not the behavior of a man who sought control. They were the acts of a man determined to rebuild trust brick by fragile brick. And with each passing day, her heart softened, not out of dependency, but out of recognition that love, when fought for with humility, could become stronger than fear. One evening, after Leah had gone to bed, Richard invited Tamara to walk with him through the garden behind the mansion. The moonlight illuminated the marble fountain, casting shimmering reflections across the path, and Tamara realized it was the same garden she had first stepped into, drenched from the rain and desperate to sell her tray of sweets. She paused, the memory crashing over her, and whispered, "I never thought I'd walk this path as anything but a stranger." Richard turned to her, his face solemn, and replied, "I never thought I'd find life here again." They stood for a long moment in silence, the weight of their shared journeys pressing gently between them. Then Richard took a deep breath and said, "I don't want to rush you. I don't want to push, but I do want to ask. Will you let me build a life with you, not out of convenience, not out of money, but out of love and respect?" Tamara's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were not of anger or despair. She thought of Leah, of the way her daughter's face lit up each time Richard entered the room. She thought of the long nights when she had faced the world alone, scraping together dollars for medicine, believing no one would ever choose her for more than pity. And she thought of Richard, broken and desperate, who had made a terrible mistake but had found the courage to face his failure and become better for it. She nodded slowly, her voice trembling but steady enough to carry the truth. "Yes, Richard, but only if we build it on honesty this time. Only if you see me not as someone to protect, but as someone to stand beside." Richard's chest tightened, his green eyes glistening with gratitude. "Beside you," he whispered, "always." Their path forward was not without challenges. There were whispers in the community, murmurs about the black single mother and the wealthy white businessman, judgments passed by those who saw only race and status rather than the love that had grown between them. Tamara heard them at the market, caught the stares at preschool drop-offs, and felt the sting of prejudice more sharply now that her life was entwined with Richard's. But she also saw the strength in her daughter's innocence. Leah introduced Richard proudly as her daddy to anyone who asked, unconcerned with the color of his skin or the weight of his bank account. To her, love was simple and true. The man who showed up every day, who kissed her scraped knees, who told her bedtime stories, was her father. And Tamara realized that children often saw more clearly than adults, blinded by bitterness. Richard confronted his own battles as well. He faced colleagues who questioned his decisions, old friends who whispered behind his back, and even extended family who suggested his choices would tarnish his legacy. But he stood firm, his voice unwavering when he declared that his legacy was no longer in boardrooms or profit margins, but in the laughter of a little girl and the strength of the woman he loved. He told them plainly that money had nearly destroyed him, that power had left him empty, and that he would not trade his new family for any fortune. The more he spoke this truth, the lighter his shoulders became, as though the mansion itself began to shed its ghosts, replaced by the warmth of life slowly returning. Months passed, and the change was undeniable. The house that had once been silent now hummed with energy, Leah's laughter echoing down the staircases, Tamara's voice singing softly in the kitchen, Richard's footsteps steady and sure as he came home not to emptiness but to love. Together, they repainted the walls of the guest room where Tamara and Leah had first stayed, transforming it into Leah's bright and permanent bedroom filled with storybooks, stuffed animals, and drawings taped to the walls. They planted a small vegetable garden, something Tamara had always wanted but never had space for, and Richard knelt beside her in the soil, his hands dirty, his heart full. It was not wealth that built their new life, but small acts of care, repeated daily until the wounds of the past no longer defined them. One evening, as Leah played with blocks on the living room floor, she asked innocently, "Mommy, are we a real family now?" Tamara knelt beside her, kissed her curls, and whispered, "Yes, sweetheart, we always were. But now we get to stay together." Richard, sitting nearby, felt tears burn his eyes at the simplicity of the truth. For all the battles, betrayals, and heartbreak, it was Leah's pure voice that captured what mattered most. The story did not end with perfection. There would still be challenges, prejudices to confront, and wounds that needed time to heal. But Tamara and Richard faced them side by side, choosing every day to trust, to forgive, to love. And as Tamara watched Leah fall asleep one night, clutching the bear Richard had once bought for her, she realized that her greatest battle had not been surviving poverty or enduring abandonment. Her greatest battle had been learning to trust that love, real love, was not about control or rescue, but about partnership, respect, and truth. The end. If this story has moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe so you never miss the next one. I'd love to hear what you think, what part of the plot stayed with you most, and where in the world you're watching from. Share your thoughts in the comments, and let's keep this conversation going.